While we tend to imagine that church services have always looked and felt like church services today, in fact, the worship practices of the early church were a mesh of theological teaching, including the familiar and unrecognizable. The church practices were, one, rooted in the church's origins within Judaism. Secondly, they were very different from people's normal experiences today. And finally, they were filled with complex scriptural and theological symbolism. So the early church's way of worship was rooted in Judaism, especially in synagogue worship. And the early church's liturgy was actually rooted in synagogue worship. So the synagogue service had the profession of faith, the prayer of 18 blessings, the readings, the sermon, and then the priestly blessing. And then the Christian liturgy had the invocation of the Trinity, the prayers of intercession, the readings, the sermon, and then the dismissal of the catechumens. Now the Christians didn't exactly copy everything from Judaism. They actually added several things to the traditional synagogue worship and liturgy. They added the Eucharist to every service that they met, and they met very early in the morning. And they had a two-part service. First was for everyone, and then after the readings and the sermon, the catechumens left, which were the unbaptized. And then the Eucharist, and then they had the Eucharist only for the baptized. And interestingly, they also made moral pledges, which was the predecessor to the catechism. Now the first pagan to try and actually investigate this was Pliny the Younger. And after his investigations, including the capture and torture of deaconesses, he learned that, quote, they were accustomed, Christians meaning, quote, they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath, not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, to not falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return trust when called upon to do so. So the early church, had a lot of its aspects rooted in Christianity, rooted in itself, but also in Judaism. And secondly, early church services were extremely different from church services today, including separate places of worship for men and women. So one of the main differences from the early church as opposed to the modern church were segregated sections for men and women. As stated by the Apostle Paul, the section for women would have had seats and a veil separating the sections. This tradition is also passed down from Judaism, where one theory for why having the sections was that for women to maintain modesty according to the Torah, and for Christians to maintain teachings according to the Apostle Paul. And this was very important to some people, including Saint Cyril, saying, quote, let there be a separation, men with men and women with women, lest the pretext of salvation become an occasion of destruction. So it's basically saying that, like, if these two sections weren't, or if men and women weren't separated, it could rise to occasions of destruction. So finally, the early church had and maintained scriptural and theological symbolism, including and especially Eucharist, as its roots are extremely important and long. So some of the symbolism is by saying, it's the bread of God. It's like the bread of life, as stated by Saint Ignatius, quote, "I desire the bread of God, the heavenly bread, the bread of life, which is the flesh of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Now after Christ's Last Supper, he added that meaning to it. But the meaning and theological implications of Eucharist actually goes way back to the Old Testament, where God commanded, as a perpetual sign of God's old covenant with his people, the showbread, which was sacred bread and wine, perpetually on display in order to remind people of God's covenant, God's presence with his people, and that it describes the revelation of the face of God to the Israelites. Now, Jesus' actions with the Last Supper was a pivoting point, using kind of like this showbread symbolism as away from the old covenant to a new one, which doesn't rely on you being perfect, but on grace, and which promises eternal life. And so the Eucharist has profound meaning and theological and scriptural symbolism that can be traced back all the way to the Old Testament. So while we tend to imagine that church services have always looked and felt like church services today, it is in fact very different, and were a mesh of theological teachings, including the familiar and unrecognizable, including that the church's practices were rooted in Judaism, were very different from people's normal experiences, and they were filled with complex scriptural and theological symbolism. Thank you.